This is Let Your Life Speak, an audio program highlighting the exceptional work of Sidwell Friends School alumni. I'm Bryan Garman, head of school for Sidwell Friends, a pre-K through 12th grade independent Quaker school located in Washington, D.C. In this interview, I sat down with Mason Morfit, an alumnus from the class of 1993. Mason is currently the president and chief investment officer at ValueAct Capital, a San Francisco-based investment firm. Since joining ValueAct in 2001, he's had the distinction of serving on the boards of a variety of public companies, including Microsoft. This fall, Mason spoke with me about his work, the ethical considerations that frame it, and how Sidwell Friends has shaped his career. Here we are at Bird Studios in San Francisco with Mason Morfit, class of 93, who's fresh off a John Mayer concert. Mason, thanks for making time to be here today.
Nice to be here. Thanks for coming to San Francisco.
Yeah, well, this is my favorite place to come. We come here more than any other city than New York, so thanks for being so hospitable to us. Why don't you tell us a little bit, if you would, about your journey out of Sidwell Friends, right? So I know you went to Princeton, but walk us through that and how you ended up out here on the coast.
Yeah, I mean, if I can back it up, I'll do the journey into Sidwell Friends too.
Okay, that's terrific.
My father was a diplomat with USAID, State Department. I grew up until I was in middle of 6th grade in India and Indonesia. And I went to British schools. There was no internet back then, and not a lot of cultural connection between the United States and these places, parts of the world. And I showed up in 6th grade and did half a semester at public school, and then I showed up at Sidwell in 7th grade in the fall of 1987. At that point, I had never seen or played American football, basketball, and had, wasn't really plugged into what the television shows or movies or music of the day was. Interestingly, the year 1987 is seared in my brain musically, which was the U2 Joshua Tree, Beastie Boys,
Good
License
album.
to Ill, and yeah, it was an era that it has special resonance for me. Anyway, I showed up and went 7th through 12th. For a short period of time, my mom was the director of the Chinese Studies program, which was, I think, fairly new at the time. And graduated in 93, went to Princeton, graduated in 97. After a few twists and turns finding myself, I ended up in San Francisco, joining an investment firm called ValueAct Capital that was founded in 2000. And I've been there ever since. We grew it from nothing to over $10 billion in assets under management, managing money for a lot of endowments and foundations and pension plans around the world, with the idea that you could buy stocks in public companies and have a voice in the governance and oversight of these companies.
Activist investing.
Which was not a term that was coined at the time the firm was founded, but came to be a thing. And we have since broadened it out from North America to Europe, companies like Rolls-Royce, Reuters, and now Asia, Japan, and potentially further other regions, which is interesting because it brings me back to my roots of where I grew up as a kid. So that's the story in a nutshell.
How did that international experience shape your vision around your work and also about your ethical core?
Talking about the ethical core sounds
big. How did it shape your
highfalutin? But I would say the growing up in extreme poverty around you. Obviously, I didn't live in extreme poverty, but observing it was an interesting, eye-opening experience. Also being a minority in a country, and also being surrounded by a lot of international people. The kids in the school I went to were from India, Australia, Indonesia, the UK, Scotland, and I think in a positive way, it taught me how to get along with all kinds of different people, no matter what their background is. I have an uncanny ability to decode highly accented English, no matter what the accent. And I think sensitivity to kind of where people are coming from that's the good thing. On the double-edged sword of that is you sort of always feel a little bit like an outsider anywhere you are, because you don't really have a grounding in a place that's called home, and you're more of a citizen of the world in both the good and bad of that. But I'd say that's the lasting legacy of that experience.
How did that outlook that you had in terms of being able to relate to many different kinds of people extend to Sidwell Friends?
Well, Sidwell was also a very diverse place back then, and now I think it's even more so,
right?
Which I really liked about it. And when I reflect on the institution, there was a lot of that I respect about the mission and the faculty and staff and the ethos and the culture and the essence of the place. Without being too glib about it, you marry that up with the teenage brain and the student body, which is sort of going through its own personal chapters, right, of growth.
Many crises,
and it's an interesting combination. And so I think some of the benefits of that, being immersed in a place like that, were not obvious until later in life, right? Because at the time you're just trying to, hang out with your friends, get through it, get your work done,
right?
Get into college,
right?
And I've observed, and thanks to social media, you can really track what happened to your fellow alumnus and alumni around the world. And it's really interesting to me to watch the careers that they've chosen and some of the decisions they've made and contributions they've made to the country and the world. And so that's cool to watch. But I think that I've chosen a career that's investing, in companies where you're arriving as an outsider to the party, as a minority participant without a lot of power, and having to gain trust and consensus about affecting cultural changes at companies. And some of these are large companies like Microsoft, and some of them are smaller ones. But it requires a kind of personality and personal touch that's consensus oriented and gentle, but also firmly convicted. And I think that's a good description of Quaker processes and Quaker values too.
How does that play out in real time in terms of what you were doing with Microsoft, which is kind of a legendary experience, I would guess, for you?
Yeah, it's one I still feel I have to pinch myself of, and it was a great experience being at an iconic company at a really particular point in time when the leadership of the company was being passed from Steve Ballmer to Satya Nadella, who interestingly was an Indian immigrant, outsider.
So there's a theme.
Highly empathic human being from whom I learned a lot. The issues facing that company were pretty profound. The underlying technology shifts that were going on that many felt had left the company in the dust were actually real opportunities for it, provided it could change and abandon some of its long-held cultural beliefs and attitudes. And that without getting into too much of the details in the inside baseball, required a common grounding in the facts and what was real and what was true and what was not true. It required courage to change both the people that were involved and also some of the really organizing principles behind the company, such as Windows is the ultimate aim of all of Microsoft, and therefore everything should be subservient to it, and you should try to build phones that run Windows and not embrace other platforms, and letting go of paradigms. And I think to get an organization of almost 100,000 people to do things like that is difficult, and it takes getting there, like I said, is a journey, and it's not something that you can mandate heavy-handedly. Anyone can, certainly not me, but it is something that you can be a part of if you come in open-minded, willing to engage and have your own mind changed about things. And there were things that I think when we made our investment in Microsoft, we thought that turned out to be wrong, but we were happy to be proven wrong. And on the flip side, were the things that we could teach and bring to the table that I think they embrace. Particularly Satya was very open-minded about embracing things. And that Satya has this quote that the learn-it-all always outperforms the know-it-all. The learn-it-all always beats the know-it-all. And I've just taken variations on that theme and kept replaying that over and over in my mind, because nobody likes a know-it-all for a lot of reasons.
Right.
And the know-it-all actually usually doesn't get very far, because nobody wants to see the know-it-all win. Nobody wants to do what the know-it-all tells them to do. But if you reorient yourself as a learn-it-all, you create win-win situations where you grow and the counterparty grows as well. And that's what we've tried to do at my firm, and what I've tried to kind of live, right, as a human being and as a professional.
You mentioned that it took some courage to make some changes at Microsoft. Moving from being a know-it-all to a learn-it-all is a pretty courageous transformation to make, especially if you're in the leader seat, right?
Right.
What were the key moments that affected that shift?
And again, I really do have to give more than the lion's share of the credit to the leadership team that did this. But I'll tell you some stories that kind of are particularly narrow to my vantage point. Usually when we come into a company and present some outsider views to the company, they're threatening to the status quo. They're uncomfortable truths, inconvenient truths, right? And so we generally present these things and do it quietly and respectfully behind the scenes to the chairman or the CEO, and they either disappear or they get refiltered and they show up sort of gradually piecemealed out. The first thing Microsoft did was when I showed up and presented a document with my thoughts from the outside in, is they put it on the internal intranet for the entire board of directors and the entire senior leadership to see. And I thought that was remarkable. I'd never seen a company do that, which is to say,
so
fearlessly, let's put this on the table,
right?
And let's talk about it. So that's a very narrow and relatively insignificant anecdote from where I stand. But from where Satya stood, he inverted the paradigm from we will win at all costs and we will dominate and we will crush and we will destroy into one in which we will work together, right? And he built stitched together a coalition of players in the software ecosystem that used to be at war and at odds with the company, and thought about the industry as one of sort of cooperation and coexistence rather than, Hobbesian competition.
Yeah. So this was part of a major cultural shift that you brought to Microsoft.
That he brought to Microsoft, yeah.
But you were certainly...
I was there.
You were helping out and supporting it as an investor on this, because
as an investor and a board member, yeah.
Right. And when you bring these issues to companies as an activist investor, are they mostly operational issues you're bringing, or are there also ethical and cultural issues that you recognize as someone from the outside looking in, and you're looking to transform culture? That is to say, so is Microsoft a common experience, or was that more of an uncommon experience where you were actually shifting the culture of the place?
Here's what I've observed over time, and hopefully this makes some coherent sense. I think companies, countries, maybe schools, organizations coalesce around certain paradigms and worldviews and missions. And those missions are not, sometimes they are permanent and evergreen, but many times they are helpful and constructive for a period of time before they become actually hindrances. And I'm a student of human psychology as well. I think the same thing happens to human beings as they grow, right? And from various life stages, I think companies and organizations go through similar life cycles. And it is very often the case that when we engage with a company, what is holding them back is their old paradigms and belief systems, right? Microsoft's prioritization of Windows overall would be one good example of it. Another paradigm might be if you're not growing, you're dying. Go big or go home. Grow, 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 grow. And a lot of times they'll come into companies that have just had this ethos of sort of aggressive growth at all costs that has led them to do a lot of diversifying actions into things that actually become hindrances to them because they're spread way too thin on a lot of different fronts that aren't working, and it's distracting everybody, and the whole thing kind of comes crashing down. Another paradigm might be profit above all. Mm-hmm. And I think that one has been an issue for corporations. That is, the problems with that paradigm are raising their ugly head everywhere you look right now. And I trace some of that back to an ideological legacy coming out of the University of Chicago and Milton Friedman about the sole purpose of a corporation is shareholder value and profits. And if you take that to extreme, you may neglect your employees, your environment, your communities, and your customers, and that can come crashing down. And I think there's lots of examples of that happening. And so I'd say broadly, at the time that we invest in companies, they're generally fallen angels. They're companies that were once great that have fallen on hard times. And I think more often than not, it is about these paradigms that they're beholden to that are sort of inhibiting their progress, and you got to let it go. And so that can be sometimes operational, sometimes prioritization, and sometimes philosophical. But to come from the outside and say, it's okay, it's time to move on from this and reorganize yourself around something different. I'm going to turn this back on you and see if there's any analogy to schools as they go through various life cycles, and whether there are periods of time when they're foundation myths or foundation cultural premises that serve very well for a launch phase, and then maybe society changes or cultures change, and that might be, I don't know, like single sex to co-ed or whatever. I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
Things like this happen.
Yeah, we're in one of those shifts right now. I think that people are examining what's the best way for students to learn.
Right.
Is it this model where we instill knowledge in students? Is it an AP model,
right,
where we're teaching kids to learn as many facts as they can? Or is it a more open model where we want kids to be judged by the quality of their thinking rather than what exactly it is that they know from a perspective of content knowledge? And you can't ignore content knowledge, of course, right? Because you have to have some context in which to think.
Right.
And that knowledge makes a lot of sense. But we are looking at ways to try to find more time and space for kids to think more deeply about what they're doing, rather than trying to push them through a curriculum at light speed and doing something that is very cursory as opposed to something that is real deep learning. And that's one of the reasons why we decided to lay down the AP curriculum.
Yeah, I want to talk more about that, because for sure, when I was a student at Sidwell, and I do think I do credit a lot of setting me up for success happened at Sidwell. It was a light speed push through and accomplish. And the paradigm that I felt like I was bought into and part of was academic achievement, standardized test scores, AP scores, grades, Ivy League school.
And you did it
at all costs.
You told me you spent a lot of time in the library at Georgetown studying for AP Bio.
I mean, some of the work that I think the hardest I've ever worked in my life was junior year at Sidwell, and I used to go to Georgetown University Library every weekend and work on my 30-page American Studies paper for Ellis Turner or Mrs. Lanowette or whatever it was, and then the AP Bio for Mrs. Fields, and it was unbelievable workload, and I think taught me an incredible amount of gave me an incredible amount of drive and work ethic, and I don't even think I held a candle to some of my friends who were doing that plus working on Horizon. My friend Joe Mares would pull all-nighters, and he'd catch up sleeping under the bleachers in the old gym during meeting for worship, but he'd the intensity of the experience was great. It's interesting to me that you guys are reconsidering whether that is the be-all, end-all in the paradigm that should be.
Yeah.
And because I strongly support.
You did. That's good to hear. Thank you. That's a quotable right there. Yeah. Well, I mean, let me ask you, what was lost in that experience?
I don't think I deeply loved learning until I got to college. Now, I was set up well because I didn't have to kill myself just to keep my head above water when I got to college, that I had the freedom to really dive into things that were super interesting to me. And when I was in college, I studied everything from art history to philosophy to astronomy to, you name it, all over the map. And I deliberately tried not to specialize in anything, but to be sort of an omnivore of the classes that I could take. And I really got a lot out of them. And I remember having sort of viscerally intense, like, intellectual experiences where I was like, this is awesome. I really love this.
Well, what was one of those moments maybe? Like what course or what were you reading? Whose class were you sitting in when that happened?
Well, so again, this is a little bit ironic, but I was an economics major, but I deliberately tried to make it as liberal artsy as possible. My favorite courses were things like analyses of capitalism and the Berlin Wall and Soviet Union had crumbled. So there were a lot of economists that had gone to try to help Yeltsin rebuild the Soviet economy. And how do you think about economic models and models of human behavior? Because economics is basically applying mathematics to psychology. How do you mathematically model how a human being is going to behave? And I wrote one of my junior papers in college on Mahatma Gandhi's economic theories, which are proposed that unlike traditional Western economics, where it's supply demand curves and everything else is built upon the idea that more and consuming more is better, that there's actually a point of diminishing returns to that, and actually community matters and society matters and your fellow man matters and things like that. And if that's true, how do you upend all of the equations and mathematics of economics? And so that's an example of sort of the light bulbs going on in my head where I was like, this is really cool stuff. And I credit Sidwell with freeing me to be able to like think at that higher level. Mm-hmm. The other thing I would say that's interesting is that intense grounding and ability to kind of like push and learn gave me a lot of self-confidence to cover, again, omnivorously from lots of different academic subjects. And in 2005, we were looking at investing in a company that made DNA sequencers. Two different companies. One that had powered the Human Genome Project of the 1990s, and one that was emerging. And in order to make that investment, both of those investments, you had to really understand DNA synthesis. And I still had my AP Bio books from Mrs. Field's class, and I could go back and ramp up really quickly on how that stuff worked. Yeah. And we funded a company that is now called Illumina that has revolutionized the cost of DNA sequencing, taking it from $1 million per genome down to $1,000. And again, we were a small part in that, but at a critical moment when the company was running out of money, we put $8 million into it to keep it alive. And here I had literally, beyond the basic science requirement in college, which for me was Psych 101 and something called Civil Engineering 262, which was looking at slides of pretty bridges. I didn't have any post-Sidwell science experience and no biology experience, but I had the grounding and the courage to just be like, I can get into this, I can ramp back up, and then I can go in and dive into sort of like higher level expert text and have conversations with people at Cambridge University and at the Broad Institute and stuff to learn this stuff and ramp up. And so to me, what I think is most important for students and professionals of the future is the ability to sort of in any discipline have the basic groundings, but the ability to learn and ramp up on the fly. And one of the things we ask our analysts to do all the time is to say, nothing about radio frequencies and how walkie-talkies work, but we're going to look into making an investment in a company that does those kind of things for police officers and fire. Learn, go. And between Wikipedia, YouTube, and Google, you can read anything you want and pretty much pick up the phone and call anyone you want and ramp up the learning curve. Sidwell, I think, gave me that grounding and the confidence to just say, you name it, I can do it.
Yeah.
And confidence in just jumping off the cliff, is, Woody Allen said, life is 90% of life is showing up. And I think it's
I believe
showing up and then being willing to jump and say, I can do this. Right. And I think Sidwell did give me that. But if you guys are thinking about curricularly, not just trying to check boxes and getting test scores, but preparing people to be able to say, I can go anywhere, talk to anyone and learn anything. Which sounds like an arrogant thing, but I don't think it really is. I think it's confidence and an openness and,
It's
issue.
confidence without arrogance.
Yeah.
Right. It needs to be that. There needs to be
hopefully.
some humility
Maybe
if
not
you're
everybody
willing
would
to
say that
learn.
about me, but like I think
Well, but it's also this movement from the know-it-all to the learn-it-all.
Exactly.
Right. It's the same kind of paradigm shift that you were talking about with Microsoft.
yes. And what we, again, not to keep harping back to the culture I'm trying to build at ValueAct, but it is learn it all, in parentheses with the courage to go anywhere and do anything, right?
Yeah.
And I think with a mission, right, that goes beyond making money, but actually, obviously we have to do that, otherwise we wouldn't have any clients. But to leave each company better off than you found it, to treat people respectfully and to have good intentions. Because if you do that, the world does want to teach you things.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So if you have a basic grounding and a willingness to ask the questions and you walk the walk of having good intentions, like things, it's remarkable where the world takes you. And
So you lay some of what is happening today in terms of the pursuit of profit at the feet of Friedman. Where do you look in economic theory? Where do you look in your analysis of capitalism to find thinkers that are influential to you in trying to move beyond profit?
I've got a long list of folks that are the topic has become very hot recently, right? And I think therefore there's lots of places you could go for this, from the World Economic Forum to sort of just any of the op-ed writers in any major newspaper to The Economist, et cetera. I think that let me sort of back this up for a second, because I think there's some universal issues here. One of the hard things about being a leader of anything, school, investment firm, company, is trying to do two things. One, make decisions in the face of uncertainty with imperfect information and having to make them just quickly. And two is balancing trade-offs between competing values and competing constituencies, all of whom are valid and have merit, but very few of whom are totally in alignment with each other. And the reason why I'm being so long-winded about this is because I don't think there's a single source that can actually elucidate the dimensions of this problem. Because I took some notes on this before I got here, but if you think about the value trade-offs, right? One of the things that any organization has to deal with is sort of meritocracy versus culture. A culture of sort of collegiality, and I mean, there's a little bit of this AP versus learning, right? Or we
Sure.
can have because without hardcore meritocracy, you risk free riders and you risk laziness and and slipping standards, right? But you also push it too far and you get a culture of that's not positive, or not, it becomes a sort of know-it-all and kill, crush, destroy kind of culture, which you don't want to have. Another sort of history of like what got us here versus future and where we're going, right? And trying to respect the traditions and maybe some of the faculty, institutions, organizations of the past versus embracing the way of the future. Again, AP sounds like a perfect example of that. Another sort of different definitions of success, right? Profit versus customer experience versus your own team's experience versus the environment versus all these other sort of goals, time horizons, near term versus long term, et cetera. And it's taking in those sort of values and then all these constituencies, my internal team versus the companies that I work with versus my clients versus the folks in the community versus my government versus my all these constituencies sort of come if you think about them as balls that you're all trying to juggle at the same time, and you've got to figure out which ones to catch when and which ones to let
You're discerning
drop.
shades of gray, to use another kind of metaphor.
And it comes hot and heavy when you have a crisis,
Right.
And then all these things, past versus future, merit versus, constituency A versus constituency B, right? And trying to do the right thing becomes complete fog of war. And the best you can hope for is to, try your best, and you're going to piss off a lot of people and probably not make everybody happy, maybe not make anybody fully happy, right? But try to do your best and get through to the best thing.
I'm familiar with the pattern.
Right. And so a simplistic framework that is just profits overall and you can measure the scorecard and we win.
Right.
Doesn't make sense because the problem doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
And, those flashpoints where all of those values and all of those constituencies land on the floor with a thud and crash and breaking, it's incredibly emotionally draining for me. And I've had a few of those.
You've seen that. Can you share something like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of, painful things that dredge up, but like 10, 15 years ago, one of our longtime employees, CFO, was accused of insider trading. And I had to go to his house, and this is a guy I worked with for a long time, and I had to personally repossess his computers, take back his badge, put him on leave, cooperate with federal authorities. And to this day, he settled without admitting or denying wrongdoing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what happened.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But this was a member of my team,
Mm-hmm.
and I had to do the hard thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've been on boards of directors where companies have been under investigation, indictment, and sometimes U.S. Senate and congressional investigation, and I had to run independent investigations. I had to get to the truth as best we could do it. I've had to sever many times people that were friends of mine and for performance reasons or other, alter or end their careers.
Mm-hmm.
Those are really hard if you care about people.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've been a learn it all with those people, and if you've been trying to do the right thing, and it happens. And that's the kind of the catch-22s you get into, I think, when you take on a job that has leadership and responsibility involved. And it's not all hunky-dory. It's and again, I don't know how much of these kind of things you want to talk about, but as a leader of the school, I mean, this probably goes with your territory even more than mine.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially in a small, tight-knit community that has a Quaker ethos where you want to care about everyone. You do care about everyone. But sometimes there are difficult situations where you have to make a decision. And, I think you're right. I have a lot of empathy for what you're saying in terms of needing to make decisions sometimes when not everybody knows all of the circumstances. It's not appropriate for them to know all the circumstances, and they can't.
And they never will.
And they never will, and yet you have to make a decision in that context. And that's difficult, right, because there's a whole emotional component that comes with that.
Right.
And
sometimes the needs of the organization or the greater good outweigh the needs of the individual, and that is a horrible feeling to
that's right.
mete out that justice.
Yeah.
But you got to do it.
Absolutely.
And so when I think about, I do want to probe you a little bit more on that, but just to close the loop on your question, I don't have a central text. I don't have a Bible for this stuff. You take it from literature, you take it from personal experience, you take it from mentors, you take it from articles, you take it from anywhere you can. Because this is a kaleidoscope, and there's nobody who's giving you the whole picture. Yeah. It is little pieces of glass coming at you from everywhere you go in life, and you got to bring it all together. And there is no right answer, and there's no perfect answer.
Yeah.
You just try your best.
There's no theorist who knows it all or has described it all perfectly. And the minute that somebody buys into a kind of fundamentalism around a theorist, I think is the moment people are actually in trouble.
Right.
I like your vision of the kaleidoscope.
Yeah.
The metaphor. I like that.
And you got to make sure that the red glass and the green glass and the yellow glass all feel like they got heard and were genuinely heard. And you've got to weigh all these things and make a decision.
You talk about, think about capitalism where it is right now. You think about the disparity of wealth that we have in this country. I read a piece in the New York Review of Books last week about an emerging oligarchy. Maybe it's already emerged. Is it possible to have a moral economy in the current framework that we're operating in?
I think to keep riffing on this kaleidoscope thing we just created, that's the best you can hope for. Because the world at large is also a set of conflicting values, needs, and constituencies, right?
Sure.
And you want to have competition and drive and excellence. I mean, Sidwell for me was an experience of excellence with a osmosis of Quaker values that kind of seeped in, and not just from the school, but from my parents and Quaker meeting and things like that. But I do think the excellence part is important.
Sure.
But it has its drawbacks. All of these are double-edged swords. And so I do think we're having an emerging oligarchy. Ironically, well, let me back up and try to tie all this in a bow. My parents were Quakers, still are, practicing values of Quaker simplicity and service. And my parents met teaching English in Southeast Asia, and then worked in a Quaker service project in India before becoming involved both in education and in foreign aid.
And your father's done a great job on our board, serving as a very credible Quaker voice, as well. Yeah,
that's good to hear. I'm sure he has. And and then I came to Sidwell, which again reinforced a lot of those values, but also had this value of academic excellence, and then also had sort of a spectrum of diversity, but included a lot of elite and wealthy kids. And I went forward in life and had a career in finance and business, right? And but I was a little bit tortured about it because of this this upbringing, right? And I remember, right after college, thinking maybe I should be an artist, and applying to Walt Disney, and with no credentials whatsoever, and maybe I could make movies there, and maybe I could. I lived on a ski resort for half a season, and maybe I'll hang out here, and maybe I'll go to law school. Maybe trying to. I don't think that's that uncommon for people that age, but like, and when I wrote this junior paper on Mahatma Gandhi's economics. My senior thesis was on income inequality, which was just, I think, starting to explode in the 1990s. Due to a lot of things that I think are hard to turn back: globalization, technology, financialization of the economy, and are just picking up momentum and steam. In particular, or the economy is consolidating into sort of oligarchy. Sort of industry by industry. There are network effect and winner-take-all business models that are everywhere, and even ones that don't have quite as explicitly technology-enabled network effects have economies of scale and benefits to consolidations. That's what we're seeing, and obviously the benefits to higher education and degrees are clear, and then it's colliding with. Back to this kaleidoscope issue, in California here, we have a housing crisis, which is a convergence of those trends plus zoning and environmental rules, which are well-meaning and have, real values, and that's creating, a homelessness crisis. And so where we are, I think, in the U.S. economy is either cynically out of fear of what a populist backlash will mean for them, or genuinely out of watching what's happening to the community. And you could take either side of that. I think it's more genuine than people think. Businesses are saying we have more of a responsibility to a broader constituency set than just our shareholders and making money, right?
Oh, this has played out in the Bay Area, right around the homeless question.
Yes. We have several leading companies in the Bay Area. Salesforce.com has always had a mission of giving 1% of its profits to charity, and really encouraging sort of community engagement by its citizens, and there are a lot of interesting individual and collaborative philanthropic efforts designed to bring technology-based solutions and innovations to the social sector coming out of businesses, corporations, and wealthy individuals. So it's not, nothing is black and white. There isn't sort of business bad, social sector good.
Right.
That sort of the worlds collide and intersect and can learn, again, back to the learn it all thing, from each other a lot. And so it will be really interesting what happens going forward, because from a pure kind of market forces standpoint, you saw the Business Roundtable say that they think corporations should have more than just a shareholder mission. They just, right now, most corporations, particularly incorporated in the state of Delaware, have a fairly clear fiduciary duty to shareholders, but not other constituencies. And that may be changing. It's certainly changing attitudinally. And then you have politicians on the left talking about legislating this, right? And moving towards a model that looks more like Germany, where labor gets represented on the board of directors and the company legally has duties to more than just its profit obligation to make a lot of money. And so I think it's happening from the top down governmentally and from the bottom up. And at the same time that you're seeing a lot of innovation in sort of social services and philanthropy and technology, and it's pretty exciting to watch it, actually. And I don't know where it's going to go or if it's going to work. We can take a long detour into like philanthropy and what works and what doesn't work. But the way that I've tried to think about this is there's no way I'm going to have all the answers, or any one person is, but what's the broadest set of relationships you can have to inform yourself and try to lean in and help. And for me, that has meant making philanthropic relationships, but also government relationships with local leaders in California, and also on the national level. But to try to be part of the conversation, and try to do it in venues where I don't have a vested interest, right? Because I think a lot of engagement on these issues is sort of can be colored by self-interest, which makes you sort of a less credible participant, but also takes you different places than if you're just trying to see about making the world a better place. And I will honestly say I don't think I've had a huge impact yet. Yeah, but
it's something
on my mind.
It is. And what have you done so far? Because I know that you've been involved in some building of these relationships with the governor, et cetera, the mayor of San Francisco.
Yeah, I think back to this having the audacity to think you can learn anything. So I served on a board with Bill Gates, who's the greatest philanthropist of our generation, probably. Right. And just started reading his blog and his websites and his emails, and he has book recommendations every season, which are great, and I read all those. And then I started reading about the history of philanthropy, going back Ford Foundation, Carnegie Foundation. What have people tried and failed? What has worked? What has not worked? What have been the big issues? And where have people played? I mean, obviously there's arts and there's medicine and things like that. But when you come to sort of attacking issues of education, poverty, inequality, et cetera, what have people done? And trying to get informed in that front. And then what are people doing in the present day across the country and across the world, and just reading a lot. So that's number one. Number two is rather than doing this on my own, what kind of organizations are set up to form coalitions? And there's something that I'm on the board of called Tipping Point Community in San Francisco, which pools together donor resources. So it gives out roughly $25 million a year to nonprofits. It also has a $100 million anti-homelessness initiative, which is a combination of policy change, but also actually physically constructing housing units and experimenting with programs in each of those domains. So number two is find other smart people to work with and pool your resources. And number three, I think, is just think not just business and philanthropically, but governmentally as well. And so that if you want to have an impact on your community's health, housing, poverty, it's state and local government that matters, not the federal government. And so those are the places where I've tried to both through political donations, but also, which, by the way, some people can say is not the cleanest thing in the world to do. But the way I viewed it was to begin creating a learn-teach relationship with government. And so when the governor of California, Governor Newsom, was running, I had him come into my office, and I had my interns and an investment team approach him the way we would approach the CEO of Microsoft. In other words, let's do our own work on the budget, education. Let's pick a couple things and get pretty deep in it. And then let's write a memo and make him respond to it. And he comes in, and he actually emailed me, his team emailed us yesterday about wanting to come back and do it again, because he finds it interesting to have intellectual debate. And if you have smart people that, again, can learn whether it's DNA sequencing or radio frequency or education, right? I mean, everyone, I think, as a citizen who's well educated and got a kind of broad grounding, should feel empowered and, entitled to have an opinion and do their own research. And which kind of brings me to another life principle. Again, I hate talking in terms like that because it sounds ridiculous. But one of the things that I've learned is that nobody really knows anything, no matter what their title or their background. And again, I'm having seen a lot of stuff up close, I can tell you, I just presume that, I at least have as much a right to ask a question as anybody, because all of us are in the dark trying to fumble through this kaleidoscope of issues and
so true.
Concepts and muddle along as best we can. So if you approach respectfully and humbly, not you're an idiot and you don't know anything, but we're all kind of in this together. None of us really know anything. Let's figure this out as your attitude. You also, the universe kind of meets you where you are, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. I started the year with a quote for the faculty and the leadership team that in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few.
Yes, that's a good one. Who said that?
So that is, I'd have to get the name. It's a Buddhist monk who used that in a book called Zen for Beginners.
It's really interesting you say that, because one of the things that I've tried to do organizationally at the firm is to create no functional or no industry expertise. So in a lot of places, you're the technology person, you're the consumer goods person, here it's complete free for all. And the reason why is that, because once you have positioned yourself as an expert, you're trapped with the burden of expertise, and you can't ask the dumb questions because you can't look dumb. Because you defined yourself as someone who's not dumb on this issue. If you come in and say, I'm dumb.
Well, you're the know-it-all again.
Yeah.
Right. And there's something about a beginner's mind that brings a freshness to any problem. And that freshness brings possibility.
Right. That's a good one.
There's connections to Quakerism in this too, right? Notions of continuing revelation.
Right.
A sense of humility.
Yes.
That is important, putting oneself in a position to be transformed by discourse or by a message of one or from one. All of this is consistent.
And resistant to hierarchy and authority, that everybody can have one-to-one experience with the truth.
Yeah,
right?
Direct experience. You don't need an interlocutor for that. And that's an incredibly powerful concept of our tradition, I think.
Yes.
And it's one that leads us back to a concept that you started with of courage, right? There's a certain courage that someone has to have to speak into that space.
Yeah. I've been thinking back to meeting for worship, and obviously a lot of times your 16-year-old brain remembers the more ridiculous moments. But it was a nice ritual that as a community, we're all going to sit in one place, and then anyone can get up and say whatever they want.
And there's
no matter
no
how
expert.
silly
there's no
and
expert.
stupid or ridiculous it may seem,
right.
It is received openly and with respect.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
And I mean...
Well, and that's that. It said earlier that it engenders a kind of confidence, hope without arrogance.
Yes.
Right? There's a confidence and courage to speak into that space, but there is humility to share your message with the group.
Right.
And that's a special orientation, I think, that is very unique to the Quaker experience.
Yes. It's interesting. I would say I never once spoke in meeting for worship. I'm interestingly reflecting on whether that,
But it's interesting in one thing that you were talking about in terms of the tension you felt between someone who was extraordinarily successful in economic terms and having a Quaker background. That's not something that's unique to Friends, right? There have been Friends who have been remarkably successful in business. Early capitalists were Quakers.
Yes.
Yeah. John Wharton.
Right.
The Cadburys, Clark Shoes, Barclays Bank, Lloyd's of London, Macy's department store.
Right.
Right. But there was something that they did with their wealth that separated them from many other successful capitalists.
Giving me some good reading assignments there to climb the learning curve again, to figure out exactly. But I do know that to the simplistic rubric I've always heard is that Quakers in business were successful because they were straightforward, transparent.
That's right.
And not, not sort of tough-nosed negotiators or,
They were honest.
Yeah.
And they paid their debts.
Right.
And because they paid their debts, there was confidence in working with them as bankers. I mean, their banking network emerged initially because they were excluded from the banking network in London.
Interesting.
And also they were excluded from the university system. So they had to find their own networks. They had to find their own ways of financing their businesses. But they became so successful at it that their reputation moved outside of the Quaker community, and people wanted to do business with them.
Yeah, and I think that there's some parallels there. The what they did with their wealth is something I'm less familiar with, but I will say that one of the tensions Sidwell, I think, did a very good job of elevating in my mind and all of our students' minds the importance of social activists, artists, sort of social change agents, right? The business community was sort of not, I don't think it was like maligned so much as it was kind of ignored and not really relevant. Now, that was a different story when I got to Princeton, right?
Right.
Obviously a different story when I got to Wall Street. But I didn't have a real framework for thinking about this.
Right.
I didn't have a solid feeling that it was okay or that it was like bad either. It was sort of like a nebulous thing that I had to kind of fumble my way through.
Yeah. This has been great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for making time for this. Appreciate it.